if the Inflation Reduction Act and President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill have kind of sent any signal to the market, the signal is that the government wants to fund a bunch of different technologies.
Hello and welcome to the One-to-One Global Online Tech Metals event on behalf of SA Live. I'm joined here today by Chris Berry, founder and president of House Mountain Partners, to talk all about recycling. So, Chris, thank you for joining me here today.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So I thought we could start by identifying where we are with recycling for metals. So, which jurisdictions are focusing on recycling? Are there specific metals that are being focused on? And do you see any kind of interesting players emerging right now?
Sure. So look, recycling has, I should say, quickly become a focus for automotive manufacturers and for battery producers in particular. They have realized, I think, that if we are going to go from sort of gigawatt scale with respect to battery production to terawatt scale just in the next 10 years, just the scrap alone coming from these gigafactories is going to create a real headache. And I would argue that even though battery manufacturers and OEMs will never say this publicly, they do view recycling as a headache. To your point about where we are geographically, I mean, as is the case with most of these technology or battery metals issues, you sort of have China and then you have the rest of the world. And just to keep this nice and simple and focused, I would argue that the China recycling business, or the China battery recycling ecosystem, is probably about 10 years ahead of the rest of the world. Part of that has to do with just the laws around recycling in China are very strict and straightforward. Every lithium-ion battery produced in China must be dealt with, must be recycled. And so what you have is a very competitive market over there where you have 4 or 5 major players and perhaps what I would also call kind of the long tail of lithium-ion battery recycling in China, where you have a number of, and when I say a number, it could be dozens upon dozens of just much smaller recyclers. So that's an insanely competitive and developed market, just with respect to market structure and also with respect to the technology. And so, it is what it is. I think the good news to come out of all of that is that battery recycling, whether or not we're in the European Union or in North America, I'm here in Washington, D.C., it's a nascent market, okay? The infrastructure, the businesses have not yet been built. As I mentioned before, those businesses able to handle all of the scrap, all of the end-of-life packs that we're likely to see, certainly scrap throughout the course of this decade. And I would argue end-of-life packs really hit in the 2030s, mid-2030s and beyond. So what you're starting to see in terms of market structure, I shouldn't say starting to see, what is happening today is the partnership model, where companies like LG or General Motors will partner with up-and-coming recyclers like Li-Cycle, or Ford or Amazon will partner with recyclers like Redwood Materials. And so these corporate partnerships, I think, are the way to go. Again, they resolve an issue. They resolve an immediate issue for the battery manufacturers and for the OEMs in particular, and they provide a steady kind of stream, feedstock / revenue, ultimately for the recyclers. And so, and the other thing that I'll say, and then I'll pause, is, obviously governments are involved in this game as well. Just last week, the Department of Energy doled out around $2.7 or $2.8 billion to different battery technologies. And probably about close to 500 million of that went directly into battery recycling technologies here in the United States. A company called Serba Solutions, one of the kind of big 4 recyclers, as I like to refer to them here in the US, got a grant of around $75 million to expand its capacity. And Ascend Elements, which is an earlier stage recycler, in my view, with a slightly different take on recycling and take on technology overall, received around somewhere between 400 and 500 million dollars to build out their capacity. So the government here in the United States has also realized that recycling is a challenge and it's an opportunity, and they're willing to fund it. So let me pause there. That's a lot of info, but yeah, happy to elaborate or any other questions you may have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when a couple of years ago, when I was having these discussions about the battery space, a lot of people were saying that recycling was just not at a point where it was technologically feasible or economically viable. Have a lot of advancements been made on this front? Like, are we kind of getting to a place where it's starting to make sense economically?
Yeah, well, I think that the pushback you got a couple of years ago about technological issues and economic issues, that's half right. With respect to the different technologies, you have pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy. Pyrometallurgy, again, fundamentally taking that material either in the form of scrap or battery packs, placing it in a smelter or an oven and melting it into a slag. Again, these technologies have been around for a long time. Okay, so nothing really new there. Your recovery rates, especially for lithium on the pyro side, are very, very low, to the point where lithium was never really, and I would argue today, really isn't recoverable on the pyro side. Also, pyrometallurgy has a very poor CO2 footprint, right? You can imagine if I'm firing up an oven, there's a lot of CO2 that's emitted there. And so what's happening is the battery business, the lithium ion recycling business, is moving more towards hydromet, which is more complicated, just with respect to the leaching out of the materials. A lot more acids, a lot more reagents used. It's really wet chemistry, but it does offer really competitive recovery rates, I would argue. And overall, it's got a much more favorable cost structure. So the technology is there. To come back to your original question, that's really not an issue anymore. And when you have lithium pricing, even where, not only where it is today, let's say lithium pricing falls back to $30,000 or $40,000 a ton, which I think it will over the course of this decade. Lithium ion battery recycling is still, very, very attractive from an economic perspective. And the only other thing I would just say, and then I'll pause with respect to economics, is it's not really the lithium that drives battery economics. It is the nickel and the cobalt. So as a recycler, what you're really after in terms of security of supply is nickel heavy and cobalt heavy feed. And so that's really the name of the game right now.
Okay, interesting. So earlier you started to talk about government starting to get involved in this space, as well as the auto manufacturers. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about who is getting involved, who's investing in this space, challenges and opportunities, and I suppose, what role do you really see for governments to be taking the lead or not taking the lead, to be kind of active in this space?
Sure. I think government, again, if the Inflation Reduction Act and, President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill have kind of sent any signal to the market, the signal is that, the government wants to fund a bunch of different technologies, not just recycling. I mean, they funded anode development in the most recent round. That really came from the Department of Energy. But, I think it's not that the government is looking to backstop these technologies. They're arguably looking to kickstart the development of what is essentially next generation sort of green infrastructure. And so I think that's a very positive sign to the private sector as well. And I think the private sector is responding. When you look at the amount of capital that a Redwood or a Li-Cycle have raised, and even most recently Ascend Elements, before they received these grants from the Department of Energy, raised around $300 million US in their Series C. So, I don't think government is necessarily picking winners or forcing companies to do certain things, but the process, the qualification process on the part of the government to fund these companies is quite quite laborious. I mean, these applications can go into the hundreds of pages and take months. So this isn't a situation where, President Biden's sitting there with a bazooka full of cash, just blasting money at these opportunities. They do go through a pretty rigorous process. But again, I think it's a huge vote of confidence when some of the recycling players that I mentioned earlier basically take, or I should say, qualify for these grants. And there's a lot more to come. Again, President Biden's infrastructure bill, which was passed before the Inflation Reduction Act, allocated around $7 billion for battery supply chain development. And roughly half of that, I think, was supposed to be devoted for downstream applications such as recycling. So it's very, very positive. And I think when you look at, the types of companies in the private sector that are making these investments, obviously, it's LG Chem, it's Glencore, it's companies that not only are worried about, okay, who is going to be processing our feed, but, they want to share in any upside from the growth in these companies. And that's why they're making investments on the equity side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought we could look at, it's been projected that a huge amount of the battery metals are going to be needed in order to kind of facilitate the energy transition. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the balance between new mine supply and recycling and how you see that kind of playing out as, I suppose, both industries move forward, more investment goes into both.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, look, the short answer to your question is that there is no substitute for a substantial amount more new mine supply. Okay. And that goes not just for lithium, but for nickel, for cobalt, for copper, for just about any of the battery metals. If we fast forward to 2030, and regardless of where you are in the world, the United States, the European Union, China, what have you, I would estimate that, when I look at this market and I look at gigafactory expansion today relative to where it's going to be in 2030, and then I look at recycling or recyclers expansion, again, let's ignore China for a second. I would think that recycling could handle about maybe 10 to 12% of lithium demand by 2030. Okay, so, initially, I think when people were getting educated about recycling over the last couple of years, they thought, oh, recycling is this panacea and it's going to solve this yawning supply demand gap, right, with respect to lithium. And that could not be further from the truth. It takes time, just like with any other project, it takes time to raise capital, to deploy it, and to build a recycling ecosystem. So I wouldn't think that you would see maybe more than 250,000 tons of lithium coming from recycling globally before 2030. Now, the interesting thing in my kind of crazy, comment for what we're doing today is that I think mid 2030 and beyond is when recycling gets really interesting. And I think you could easily see a situation where, say, from the mid 2030s onwards, recycled lithium in particular becomes a majority of the feedstock that is utilized in the battery business. In other words, mine supply growth flatlines and arguably declines, say, from 2035 onwards, and the majority of the feedstock used in the battery business is certainly recycled lithium and, perhaps nickel and cobalt as well. It's every story, as you know, with these metals is slightly different. But the point is, we're not going to get there. We're not going to realize that vision that I sort of have without the infrastructure in place, without these partnerships solidified. So there's a lot of work to do to kind of, I think, prove to the market that what is happening in China today with a very competitive and developed mature market can happen outside of China as well. And so lots to happen. But yeah, I think that's arguably how it plays out over the course of this decade and then going forward. One other thing I would say, just to kind of bring government back into this, in China, recycling is mandatory. It doesn't mean that batteries aren't stockpiled or landfilled. I mean, they probably are, even though that's not allowed. And in the European Union, there are two interesting mandates, I guess, or perhaps laws on the books. The first has to do with lithium-ion battery recycling recovery rates. By 2030, there are minimum recovery rates that are mandated, and that will increase by 2035. And also by 2030, there are minimum requirements for battery content, I guess, recycled battery content. So any lithium-ion battery produced in the European Union has to have a minimum amount of lithium, cobalt, and nickel from a recycled source embedded in it. That will also increase by 2035. There is no similar mandate or law here in the United States, although, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act has kind of thrown the gauntlet down and basically said if an automotive manufacturer wants to offer tax credits for their EVs, in order to get half of the tax credit, so $3,750 US, they have to certify that starting in 2024, 40% of the material in that battery by weight, or excuse me, by value, pardon me, has to be either extracted, processed, or recycled in North America, okay, or by a free trade partner. The recycling just focuses on North America. So look, that's terrific for recycling in particular, because if I think about raw material extraction, it's going to take me 7 to 10 years to build a new mine here in the United States. You could certainly build a lithium converter or a processor in a shorter period of time, but the recycling of those three options, I think, really stands to benefit with the most immediacy.
Okay, interesting. My last question really is just kind of about volumes, or like the amount of material that can really be extracted or recycled from spent batteries. Is it, not to get too technical, but maybe we can talk a little bit about percentages, or, like what parts of the battery, when broken down, really can get recycled, and how,
Sure.
how much does that impact the environmental?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes back to, the point I made earlier about the European Union and minimum recovery rates. And so any of the companies we talked to earlier, or existing recyclers today, whether or not they're in China or in the European Union, you really want to have kind of a minimum recovery rate of 90%. So 90% of the nickel, the cobalt, and the lithium in particular are what everyone is after in that order. And your recovery rates, generally speaking, vary based on the technology you use. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, pyro can demonstrate, or I should say deliver, pretty high recovery rates both for nickel and cobalt, certainly in the 90% range, but cannot do the same for lithium for whatever reason. Again, it's more of a technical limitation, and that's why people are moving more towards hydro, which has demonstrated, at least initially at scale, really, really strong recovery rates. So the recovery rates are kind of issue number one in terms of good economics or sound economics. And of course, producing battery grade material at scale is also the key. One of the interesting things that we're finding about recycling thus far here in the West is that if you think about it, it's not like you're recycling low quality material, right? You are already recycling material that at one point was battery grade. And there is initial evidence to indicate that recycled material, when it is reused in a lithium-ion battery, has performance characteristics that are superior to that of virgin mined material, which goes back to my original kind of prognostication for the mid 2030s, which is there's going to be so much recycled material in the system by 2035, and it's going to perform so much better than raw virgin ore material, that the majority of what is going to be used in the recycling or in the battery business will come from the recycling space. So again, as an investor, there are lots of things you want to think about, I think, in terms of, okay, where do I sort of place my bets? Obviously, a lithium-ion battery recycling player has to have a security of supply of raw material, whether or not that comes in the form of battery scrap or in full packs. And that speaks to the partnerships that they have, number one. And then number two, of course, to your point, Amy, is the technology. What is this company using? Is it hydro? Is it pyro? Is it a hybrid of both, or is it that direct recycling like Ascend Elements is planning on using? And then what are the recovery rates? What does the CO2 footprint look like? Et cetera, et cetera. So, those are two very, I think, initial qualification kind of criteria that you want to think about as an investor, and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, there's this burgeoning ecosystem of potential recyclers. How do I know, one is different from the other, and what should you be looking for? So those are just two issues I think that are really important.
Absolutely. No, yeah, that's all quite interesting, and certainly a lot for the industry as a whole to be kind of looking at and considering as, the energy transition continues on and the batteries industry grows. So, Chris, those were all of my questions for today. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. Looking forward to the next time we can speak.